Jyoti Hermit. I'm an assistant professor at Ewing Christian College, Allahabad. The title of my lecture today is Towards a Feminist Consciousness, Early Writings, Paper 2, Module 6. In a famous passage in a room of one's own, Virginia Woolf asked, "Why did women not write poetry in the Elizabethan age?" She went on to speculate about an imaginary Judith Shakespeare who might have been destined for a career as illustrious as that of her brother William, except that she had none of the chances that he had, and in Woolf's vision met with a tragic end. The truth is that many women wrote during the 16th and 17th century, though their writing careers were obscure and, in comparison to Shakespeare's brilliance, neglected and ignored. During that time, quite a number of Judith Shakespeares did write plays. They also wrote poems, prose fiction, diaries, prophecies, letters, tracts, philosophy. Any genre that men wrote in attracted at least some women writers. Until recently, it was thought, following on from Virginia Woolf, that early modern women writers were extremely scarce. It has now become evident, as manuscript sources as well as printed books are uncovered, that while far fewer women wrote than men, it has been estimated that an average of 1% of all published writing in the 17th century was produced by women. A bibliography of published and unpublished writing from Isabella Whitney to AphraBehn would still run to thousands of items. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, although many women writers came from aristocratic backgrounds, Mary Froth, for example, was a member of the influential Sidney family, women from much more humble backgrounds also wrote. Isabella Whitney, for example, had to earn her keep through service in a gentleman's household in London. During the course of the 17th century, under the influence of the social upheaval that was part of the English Civil War, less privileged women wrote an increasing number of works, particularly in religious genres. Examples here are Hester Biddle, Cecilia Cotton, and Mary Cole. English society changed drastically during the early part of Elizabeth I's reign. Between Whitney and AphraBehn, who lived to see the arrival of William and Mary in 1688, England had 4 further monarchs: James I, Charles I, Charles II, and James II, a commonwealth and a protectorate. While it is hard to generalize, a number of significant changes in the nature of women's writing occurred during this period, just as writing in general underwent a dramatic change. Writers such as Whitney, Amelia Lanner, and Mary Roth belong to quite a different world from writers at the end of the 17th century, such as Ben and Catherine Phillips. By the end of the 17th century, there was at least some elementary sense of a tradition or traditions of women's writing, so that, for example, the death of both Ben and Phillips saw eulogies from other writers, both male and female. On the other hand, both AphraBehn at the end and Mary Roth at the beginning of the century attracted fierce condemnations for daring to write secular literature, a preserve supposedly best left for men. While some women offered mutual support, others saw publication, if not writing itself, as demeaning. For example, the brilliant letter writer Dorothy Osborne, who was writing for her lover's eyes only, could mock Margaret Cavendish for being so foolish as to write and publish poetry. While we have some sense now of how many women wrote, it is difficult to determine who read them and in what numbers their works were distributed. This is partly because women wrote in such a wide variety of modes and genres. By the end of the period under consideration here, AphraBehn stands as one of the most successful playwrights of the Restoration, whose work was watched and read by large numbers of people. Margaret Lucas Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle, was an important writer of this age. Her work is important for a number of reasons. One is that it lays out an early and very compelling version of the naturalism that is found in current day philosophy and science. It also offers important insights that bear on recent discussion of the nature and characteristics of intelligence and the question of whether or not the bodies that have subscribed us the intelligence or have an intelligent cause. Another reason that the work of Cavendish is important is that it anticipates some of the central views and arguments that are more commonly associated with figures like Thomas Hobbes and David Hume. She also anticipates discussions in the work of contemporary philosophers such as David Chalmers and Colin McGrin about whether or not our ability to understand how matter thinks is relevant to the question of whether it does think. Cavendish lived and wrote in the thick of the mechanistic revolution of the 17th century, though many of her views about thinking matter, the nature of scientific explanation, and the intelligibility of the divine seem almost contemporary. In seeking a life of independence, in 1643, Lucas applied to be a maid of honor at the court of Queen Henrietta Maria. When the Queen was exiled to France in 1644, Lucas accompanied her and shortly thereafter met William Cavendish. They married in 1645 and would remain in exile in Paris, then Rotterdam, then Antwerp, until the restoration of the crown in 1660. There are two reasons why it is important to mention the marriage of Margaret Lucas and William Cavendish. One is that in the mid-17th century, it was unusual for a publisher to print the philosophical and scientific work of a woman. Cavendish was a successful, brilliant and impressive writer that she was able to publish some of her work without assistance, including her very first work, Poems and Fancies, in 1653. But many of her writings were published with the help of her well-connected husband. The second reason why it is important to mention the marriage of Lucas to Cavendish is that through the Cavendish Circle meetings that he had organized in the 1640s, she interacted with figures such as Thomas Hobbes, René Descartes, Marin Mersenne, Pierre Gassendi, and Kennel Digby. But these philosophers would not engage with her directly. Unfortunately, and sadly for her and for us, she had no written philosophical correspondence with any of these philosophers. When they would not critically correspond with her in print, she engaged their views critically in the form of a correspondence between herself and a fictional third person. Cavendish lived and wrote in the thick of the mechanistic revolution of the 17th century, though many of her views about thinking matter, the nature of scientific explanation, and intelligibility of the divine seem almost contemporary. In her own age, she was regarded alternately as mad, pretentious, a curiosity, and a genius. She finally received some much wanted recognition from her male peers in 1667 when she was offered an extremely rare invitation to participate in a meeting of the Royal Society. Though, to be sure, she was regarded as a spectacle by many in attendance. Over the course of her short life, she produced a number of important works in philosophy. These include Philosophical and Physical Opinions, published in 1656, Orations of Divers Sorts, Philosophical Letters, published in 1664, Observations upon Experimental Philosophy, published in 1666, The Description of a New World called The Blazing World, published in 1666, and Grounds of Natural Philosophy, published in 1668. Another writer of this period was AphraBehn. AphraBehn was an English dramatist, poetess, and novel writer. She was highly popular in the reign of Charles II, when nothing could exceed the licentious nature of the public stage, but the licentiousness of private matters. She was born in the reign of Charles I, but the year is not known, and as is stated, of a good family in Canterbury of the name Johnson. Two of her plays were published in 1671, The Amorous Prince and The Forced Marriage, and between that year and 1687, she produced no fewer than 13 other comedies or tragicomedies and one tragedy entitled Albert de Lazer, which made its appearance in 1677. It is founded upon the old play, long falsely attributed to Marlowe, called Las Dominion. Two of her plays, The Widow Ranter and The Younger Brother, were posthumous, the first having been brought out at the Theatre Royal in 1690 and the second at Drury Lane Theatre in 1696. There is no one of her plays totally devoid of merit, although it is evident that she sometimes wrote under the pressure of necessity. This indecency she seeks to excuse in the preface of her Lucky Chance, published in 1687, which says that she offended in this respect no more than her neighbors, and that her productions ought not to be examined with greater severity. She had, however, probably better talents than many of these worthless neighbors, and was besides a woman. Of the latter portion of her career, little has been ascertained, and perhaps the result of an investigation might be anything but satisfactory. In 1684, 1685 and 1666, she published 3 volumes of miscellanies in verse, including pieces by the Earl of Rochester and Sir George Etheridge, together with the translation of Rochefoucauld's Maxims. One of her most remarkable pieces is a version of Ovid's epistle, Onon to Paris, which, with others, was printed under the sanction of a preface by Dryden. In this, he avows that she did not understand Latin. She had not attained her 50th year at the time of her death on the 16th of April, 1689, after a tedious illness. She was buried in the eastern ambulatory of the cloisters of Westminster Abbey. During her life, she was very commonly known by the poetical appellation of the divine astray, a circumstance which misled Langbaine when, in his account of dramatic authors, he called her Mrs. AphraBehn. Gilden published a collected edition of her separately printed plays, and such was their discredibility, popularity, that they reached the 80s. Gilden published a collected edition of her separately printed plays, and such was their discredible popularity that they reached the 8th edition in 1735. Women in the 18th century England were not expected to be much more than wives and mothers. Their place was in their home, taking care of the children. Women were also supposed to be modest and generally uneducated. Society's ideas placed many restrictions on the opportunities of women. Yet, Some women fought against these restrictions and inhibitions, surviving for independence, not only with their actions, but with their thinking as well. These pages contain just a few of the women who overcame and surpassed society's traditional standards. Here you will find 9 of the most significant women writers of the 18th century England, a brief biography of each and samples of their writings. These are women who not only raised families and often embraced the traditional role of women, but who also challenged the definition of what it means to be a woman. They revolutionized society's views towards women and paved the way for future generations to express their many talents and thoughts about the world they lived in. These are the authors, poets, novelists, and playwrights whose work not only impacted 18th century society, but whose influence continues even today. Many of these women were forced to write under anonymous names because of their families' lack of approval and their fear that if discovered, society's rules would prevent future efforts. They could only remain anonymous for long. It was only a matter of time before their works reached the hands of the British audience, and their readers insisted on knowing the identities of these amazing minds who produced such great works. Fanny Burney, the English novelist and diarist Fanny Burney was one of the most popular novelists of the late 18th century. She was also an important chronicler of English manners, morals, and society. It was to Daddy Crisp that she addressed her first journal letters, lively accounts of the musical evenings at the Burneys' London house, where the elite among European performers entertained informally for gatherings that might include David Garrick, Dr. Johnson, Edmund Burke, and Richard Sheridan. Considered the least promising of the clever Burney children, Fanny moved unnoticed in the circle of the great, confiding her observations to Crisp. Her practice of observing and recording society led eventually to her novel Evelina, or the history of a young lady's entrance into the world, in which she captured London's literary society with its publication. Evelina revealed its author to be a keen social commentator with an attentive ear for dialect and the differentiation of London speech. It concerns the development of a young girl unsure of herself and society and subject to errors of manners and judgment. A novel treating contemporary manners in an elegant and decorous way, and depending for the development of its plot upon the erring and uncertain conduct of the heroine, was an innovation that pointed the way for the novels of Jane Austen. Her next novel, Cecilia, or Memoirs of an Heiress, incorporated moral didactic themes along with the social satire of Burney's famous first novel into a more complex plot. Carry on. Next author is Hester Lynch Tyrrell Piozzi. She is one of the most interesting female writers of the late 18th century. The only daughter of an impoverished Welsh family, she received an excellent education, although education was a word then unknown as applied to females. The first fundamental change in Piozzi's life had thus occurred in 1765, when the everyday routine of her first husband's country house came to be enlivened by prominent characters arriving from London to visit Mr. Thrale. The Streatham Circle, as it was called, rivaled the other salons and clubs of London for more than a decade, devising their own conventions and social behavior. They would read books and letters aloud, compose verses, throw notes at each other, and exchange books in which they wrote their opinions in the margins. Fanny Burney's Evelina also received this treatment, and the exchange of comments and notes became the novel's first and rather peculiar form of advertising in the world of literature. Anne Radcliffe is best known as one of the most significant contributors to the creation of the Gothic genre. Her novel, The Italian, is considered by many to be the first novel written in this genre. She is also the best-selling, most translated, and most read of all British novelists. Radcliffe's writing was heavily influenced by Romance writers from the Renaissance period. She was also influenced by Charlotte Smith, who was one of Anne Radcliffe's favorite writers. Her talent for mixing the natural and the supernatural keeps readers in suspense as they turn page after page. Nowhere is this better illustrated than in her first work, The Italian. The blending of sublime with natural scenes and mysterious and supernatural events has made this book one of the most popular novels of the 18th century. Her work has inspired Gothic and Romance writers for the past 2 centuries. Eliza Acton is considered Britain's first modern cookery writer because of the exactness of her recipes, and her well-known works are Modern Cookery in all its branches and The English Bread. Mary Wollstonecraft was the Anglo-Irish feminist, intellectual and writer. In 1788, she became translator and literary advisor to Joseph Johnson, the publisher of radical texts. In this capacity, she became acquainted with and accepted among the most advanced circles of London intellectual and radical thought. In 1790, she produced her Vindication of the Rights of Man, the first response to Edmund Burke's Reflection on the Revolution in France. In 1792, she published her Vindication on the Rights of Woman, an important work which, advocating equality of the sexes and the main doctrines of the later women's movement, made her both famous and infamous in her own time. In Maria, or the Wrongs of Woman, published unfinished in Paris in 1798, Mary asserted that women had strong sexual desires and that it was degrading and immoral to pretend otherwise. This work alone sufficed to damn Mary in the eyes of critics throughout the following century. Mary Wollstonecraft was a radical in the sense that she desired to bridge the gap between mankind's present circumstances and ultimate perfection. She was truly a child of the French Revolution and saw a new age of reason and benevolence close at hand. Mary undertook the task of helping women to achieve a better life, not only for themselves and for their children, but also for their husbands. Of course, it took more than a century before society began to put her views into effect. Thank you.